There is a silent contract you signed long before you were aware of yourself as a chooser. No pen touched paper, yet its clauses govern your life with unwavering authority. This agreement was formed in the dim territory of the unconscious, where survival once mattered more than truth, and belonging felt safer than authenticity. You do not remember consenting to it, but you live by it every day. At its core, this agreement says, "I will be accepted if I do not disturb the order." As children, we learn quickly what is rewarded and what is punished. We notice which emotions are welcomed and which provoke withdrawal. Slowly, we begin to edit ourselves. Curiosity becomes silence. Anger turns inward. Desire learns to ask permission. What begins as adaptation hardens into identity. The unconscious does not think in years, it thinks in patterns. It keeps old promises alive even when they no longer protect you. So when you try to change your life, when you reach for growth, meaning, or freedom, something invisible resists. Not because you lack discipline, but because breaking the agreement feels like betrayal. The psyche fears exile more than stagnation. This is why progress often collapses at the threshold. You start moving toward what you want, and suddenly fatigue, doubt, or distraction appears. These are not enemies, they are guardians of the old contract. The unconscious would rather keep you small and familiar than large and alone. Much of what you call self-sabotage is actually self-loyalty, loyalty to an earlier version of yourself who survived by shrinking, pleasing, or staying invisible. The tragedy is not that the agreement exists, but that it remains unconscious. What is unconscious feels like fate. What is conscious becomes a choice. Freedom begins not with force, but with recognition. When you see the agreement clearly, you stop fighting yourself. You understand that the resistance is meaningful. It is protecting something old and tender. And in that understanding, a new dialogue begins. One where you no longer ask for permission to exist, but give yourself consent to become. When the unconscious agreement is brought into the light, it loosens its grip, not because it was wrong, but because its time has passed. And in that moment, what was blocking everything you want reveals itself not as an enemy, but as a doorway. Much of what later appears as limitation does not originate in failure, laziness, or lack of potential, but in quiet decisions made long before conscious choice was possible. Early life is not experienced as a series of rational evaluations. It is absorbed emotionally, symbolically, and instinctively. A child does not analyze the world, they adapt to it. In this adaptation, unconscious agreements are formed, not as spoken promises, but as inner conclusions about how to survive, belong, and remain safe. These conclusions sink beneath awareness and become the invisible architecture of adult life. The child learns quickly what brings connection and what brings distance. Approval, affection, or protection may arrive when certain behaviors are displayed, while other expressions meet silence, tension, or rejection. Over time, the psyche organizes itself around these patterns. A quiet rule takes shape: to be loved. I must be this. To avoid pain, I must not be that. These are not thoughts but felt truths, stored in the body and nervous system. Because they once worked, they are preserved. What makes these agreements powerful is their invisibility. They do not announce themselves as beliefs, they operate as reality itself. The adult does not say, "I'm afraid to be seen," but rather, "I'm just not that kind of person." The agreement has fused with identity. Desire then collides with an internal boundary that feels natural, justified, even moral. The psyche quietly enforces the old contract. As life unfolds, opportunities arise that threaten these early conclusions. Success might require visibility. Intimacy, require vulnerability. Independence might require disappointing others. Each time, the unconscious agreement activates its defenses. Anxiety appears, motivation collapses, distraction multiplies. The individual experiences this as personal weakness, unaware that an ancient survival strategy is reasserting control. These limitations are not random. They are precise. They emerge exactly where growth would require the abandonment of an old role. The agreement insists, if you change, you risk losing love, safety, or identity. The unconscious does not calculate probabilities, it remembers emotional truths. Even when circumstances have changed, the body reacts as if the original danger still exists. What is most tragic is that these agreements were formed without consent. The child did not choose them freely, they were negotiated under dependency, yet the adult continues to live by them, often defending them as just the way things are. In this way, limitation becomes normalized, even protected. The psyche would rather repeat the known pain than face the unknown freedom. Only when attention turns inward does the pattern begin to loosen. When one notices that resistance appears consistently at the edge of expansion, curiosity replaces self-blame. In that moment, limitation reveals its origin, not in incapacity, but in memory. And memory, once recognized, belonging achieved at the expense of truth, is fragile. It depends on continuous performance. The individual remains vigilant, monitoring reactions, adjusting behavior, and avoiding exposure. Freedom is postponed indefinitely in favor of acceptance that never feels fully secure. When authenticity finally stirs, it often arrives as restlessness or quiet grief rather than rebellion. The unconscious agreement resists openly, reminding the psyche of what was once at stake. Yet beneath the fear lies a deeper recognition. Safety without truth is a narrow shelter. And what was once chosen for survival eventually becomes a barrier to aliveness. Resistance to change is rarely a sign of laziness or lack of will. More often, it is the psyche acting as a guardian of an old survival pattern. The mind does not measure truth in terms of growth or fulfillment. It measures safety. What once preserved connection, reduced pain, or ensured stability is treated as valuable, regardless of whether it still serves the present moment. Change, from the perspective of the unconscious, is not progress but threat. Survival patterns are formed in periods of vulnerability. During those times, the psyche learns through emotional consequence rather than logic. It discovers what must be done to avoid loss, chaos, or abandonment. These discoveries settle deep into the nervous system, where they are stored as bodily memory. Long after the original conditions disappear, the body continues to respond as if they are still active. When change approaches, it does not arrive as an abstract idea. It is felt as destabilization. The psyche senses that familiar structures are being challenged, and it responds with protective resistance. Procrastination, sudden exhaustion, confusion, and self-doubt emerge not as obstacles but as alarms. Their function is to slow movement toward the unknown and restore psychological equilibrium. This resistance often intensifies precisely when progress is near. At the threshold of transformation, the old pattern feels most endangered. The absence of an immediate answer triggers fear. The unconscious prefers a known limitation over untested freedom. What makes this resistance so persuasive is its emotional authority. It does not argue, it convinces through sensation. Anxiety tightens the chest, fatigue drains momentum, doubt whispers plausible reasons to stop. These experiences feel personal and factual, leading the individual to conclude that change is simply not meant for them. Yet this protection is outdated. The psyche is defending a version of reality that no longer exists. The environment has changed, but the internal map has not. The resistance remains loyal to the past because it does not know the present. It only knows what once worked. This creates an inner conflict where conscious intention and unconscious loyalty move in opposite directions. The person wants change, but the body resists it. Effort alone cannot resolve this conflict because effort is perceived as aggression against the protector. The more force is applied, the stronger the resistance becomes. Understanding alters the relationship. When resistance is seen as a protector rather than an enemy, the internal war softens. Curiosity replaces judgment. The individual begins to notice when resistance appears and what it is guarding. This awareness does not erase fear, but it reduces its authority. Change becomes possible not when resistance is conquered, but when it is reassured. The psyche slowly learns that survival no longer depends on the old pattern. In that recognition, resistance loses its urgency and movement becomes natural rather than forced. Self-sabotage is often misunderstood as a personal flaw, a failure of discipline, or a lack of desire. Yet beneath the surface it frequently has nothing to do with weakness. It is more accurately a form of unconscious loyalty. The psyche does not sabotage what it considers essential, it protects what it pledged to preserve. When behavior repeatedly undermines conscious goals, it is often honoring an older commitment that has never been questioned. These commitments are formed in early relational environments where attachment mattered more than individuality. The child learns not only how to behave, but whom they are allowed to become. Certain traits are rewarded with closeness, while others lead to tension or withdrawal. The psyche registers these outcomes as emotional truths. From them, silent vows emerge: do not outgrow them, do not surpass them, do not disrupt the bond. These vows are not moral decisions, but survival strategies. Later in life, when ambition, confidence, or visibility arise, they may activate these buried loyalties. Success might feel like betrayal. Independence might feel like abandonment. Joy might feel disloyal to a family system built around struggle. In such moments, the psyche intervenes. Opportunities are missed, effort dissolves, focus disappears at critical points. To the conscious mind, this feels irrational and frustrating. To the unconscious, it is an act of fidelity. Self-sabotage is therefore often relational rather than individual. It maintains psychological alignment with those to whom loyalty was once necessary. The individual may unconsciously remain small, conflicted, or stuck in order to preserve a sense of belonging that was once conditional. The cost of success feels greater than the cost of stagnation. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that it operates beneath awareness. The person genuinely wants change and may try repeatedly to achieve it. Each failure then reinforces shame, which further conceals the true motive. The narrative becomes one of inadequacy rather than allegiance. This misinterpretation deepens the cycle, as the psyche now defends not only the old loyalty but also the identity of being the one who struggles. Self-sabotage also protects identity continuity. If one succeeds, who will they be, and who will they no longer be? Growth often requires separation from familiar roles, and the psyche resists such separation with subtle precision. It does not attack openly. It delays, distracts, and diminishes momentum just enough to prevent rupture. When this pattern is seen clearly, judgment begins to dissolve. The individual recognizes that what looked like self-betrayal was once an attempt to remain connected and safe. This recognition does not excuse the behavior, but it explains it, and explanation creates space. Loyalty loses its unconscious grip when it is acknowledged. The psyche can then update its understanding of belonging. It learns that connection does not require self-erasure, and that growth does not necessarily mean abandonment. In that realization, self-sabotage no longer serves a purpose, and its hold begins to weaken. What remains unconscious governs life with the authority of fate. Patterns repeat, emotions arise, and decisions are made with a sense of inevitability, as though no alternative exists. When inner forces operate outside awareness, they are experienced not as influences but as reality itself. The individual does not feel guided by hidden dynamics. They feel bound by circumstance, temperament, or luck. In this way, the unconscious disguises itself as destiny. Unconscious material does not announce its presence. It moves through impulses, attractions, aversions, and moods that feel spontaneous and self-evident. One feels drawn to the same kinds of relationships, repelled by the same risks, and stalled at the same thresholds, all while believing these outcomes are simply how life unfolds. Because the source is unseen, the result feels final. There is nothing to question, nothing to choose, only something to endure. This sense of inevitability often produces resignation. Effort is applied, but without conviction. Hope exists, but it is fragile. When attempts at change fail repeatedly, the psyche concludes that limitation is inherent, rather than conditioned. The individual begins to identify with the pattern, "This is just who I am." What was once an adaptive response becomes a defining trait. Awareness interrupts this spell not by force, but by illumination. When a pattern is noticed rather than inhabited, distance appears. The individual begins to observe themselves reacting instead of simply reacting. This observation creates a subtle but profound shift. What was once experienced as compulsion is now recognized as habit. What felt like destiny is revealed as repetition. Awareness does not immediately dissolve fear or resistance. The old impulses still arise and the familiar emotions still surge, but they no longer possess the same authority. Instead of being unquestioned commands, they become information. Choice does not mean unlimited freedom, it means the presence of alternatives. The individual may still choose the familiar path, but now it is a conscious decision rather than an unconscious submission. Even this awareness changes the psychological terrain. Responsibility replaces helplessness. Participation replaces victimhood. As awareness deepens, the sense of identity loosens. One realizes that many traits once believed to be essential are actually inherited patterns. This realization can be unsettling, as it removes the comfort of certainty. Yet within that uncertainty lies genuine agency. The future is no longer pre-written by the past. Awareness restores choice not by erasing conditioning, but by revealing it. What is seen can be negotiated. What is named can be related to. The psyche begins to evolve because it is no longer trapped in invisibility, and in that light destiny transforms into direction, shaped not by unconscious forces, but by conscious participation. True freedom does not emerge from rebellion alone, nor from the sheer force of will. It begins quietly, at the moment one realizes that much of life has been governed by contracts never consciously reviewed. These inner agreements were formed in conditions where choice was limited and survival was paramount. They once provided structure and safety, but over time they hardened into invisible laws. To live freely is not to deny their existence, but to bring them into awareness and renegotiate their terms. Renegotiation requires recognition. The psyche must first see that what feels compulsory is actually conditional. Patterns of behavior, emotional reactions, and self-imposed limits are often maintained by unspoken rules such as do not disappoint, do not exceed, or do not risk rejection. These rules operate automatically, shaping decisions before thought intervenes. Freedom is impossible while these directives remain unquestioned. When these contracts are noticed, discomfort often follows. The psyche resists scrutiny because questioning the agreement threatens stability. If the old rule dissolves, what will replace it? The unconscious fears chaos more than constraint. This is why freedom initially feels unsettling. It removes the familiar structure that once defined safety. Even if that structure was restrictive, conscious renegotiation does not mean discarding all limits at once. It is a dialogue rather than a revolt. The individual begins to ask what the agreement once protected and whether that protection is still necessary. Compassion is essential here. These contracts were formed to ensure belonging, love, or survival. Treating them with contempt only strengthens their grip. As the dialogue continues, new terms emerge. The psyche learns that safety can coexist with expression, that belonging does not require self-erasure, and that risk no longer equals abandonment. These new understandings must be embodied, not merely understood intellectually. Small acts of choice reinforce the renegotiation. Each time the individual acts in alignment with awareness rather than habit, the new contract gains credibility. Freedom then appears not as limitless possibility, but as inner permission. The permission to feel without suppression, to choose without automatic guilt, and to act without betraying oneself. The old fear does not vanish, but it no longer dictates behavior. It becomes a voice among many, rather than the final authority. This process is gradual. The psyche updates itself through experience, not declarations. Each conscious choice rewrites a clause of the old agreement. Over time, what once felt forbidden becomes neutral, and what once felt dangerous becomes navigable. True freedom is not the absence of structure, but the presence of authorship. When inner contracts are consciously revised, life is no longer lived as a reaction to the past. It becomes a participation in the present. And in that participation, freedom takes root, not as an external condition, but as an internal alignment. And so the work is not to become someone new, but to reclaim what was set aside in order to survive. The unconscious agreements that once shaped your life were never mistakes. They were intelligent responses to an earlier world. But you no longer live there. What protected you then may now be confining you. When these inner contracts are brought into awareness, they lose their power to rule in silence. You begin to choose rather than comply, to respond rather than repeat. The past no longer dictates the future, it informs it. In this shift, freedom does not arrive as sudden transformation, but as quiet authority over your own life. The moment you realize that what felt like destiny was once a decision, everything changes. You step out of inherited patterns and into conscious participation, and from that place, growth is no longer an act of defiance. It becomes a natural expression of who you are allowed to be,